The move in. The air was crisp as Emma Parker stepped out of her car, inhaling the earthy scent of Virginia's forested countryside. It was late afternoon, the sunlight slipping lazily through the trees, casting long, golden shadows across the secluded property. She took in the sight of her new home, a small, two-story house nestled at the end of a winding gravel road. Hollow Creek Road wasn't even on most maps, and the isolation had initially made her hesitate. But the thought of a fresh start and a quiet life after the chaos of the past year made this remote location feel like an escape, a place to rebuild. Emma was a nurse, used to the bustle and tension of a big city hospital. She'd left Richmond behind a week ago, moving to this sleepy rural town after accepting a job at a small hospital nearby. Hollow Creek Road might have been lonely, but it was also affordable, and the prospect of living alone in this house was somehow comforting. The landlord, Mrs. Eliza Cooper, was an elderly woman who had met her with a warm but reserved smile, as if she was handing over something fragile. "The house has its moods," she'd said, eyes narrowing slightly, "but it's a solid house. She'll take good care of you, as long as you respect her." The words had felt strange, almost as if she were talking about a living thing rather than an empty building. But Emma had brushed it off. Mrs. Cooper was probably just one of those superstitious types, the kind you find in small towns. She'd politely nodded and watched as Mrs. Cooper disappeared down the driveway, leaving Emma alone with her new home. The house was quaint, almost charming, with faded blue shutters and a wraparound porch that creaked under her feet. Inside, it smelled of wood and dust, with a slight chill despite the warmth outside. She noticed how quiet it was, the thick trees and dense forest muffling even the slightest sound. With each step, the old floorboards sighed beneath her feet, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was intruding somehow, like stepping into someone else's story. As night fell, she settled in, unpacking essentials in the kitchen and her bedroom upstairs. Outside, the darkness seemed denser than she was used to, wrapping the house in an inky cloak that felt more isolating than peaceful. She made herself a quick dinner, trying to ignore the faint prickle of unease that had settled in her stomach. Then, just as she began to relax, she heard it, a soft, shuffling noise from somewhere above her. She paused, her fork hovering over her plate. The noise was subtle, like something dragging across the floorboards upstairs. It stopped almost as soon as it started, leaving a hollow silence in its wake. Her heart beat a little faster, but she reminded herself that old houses made strange sounds. "It's just the wood settling," she whispered, her voice sounding thin in the empty kitchen. After dinner, she climbed the narrow staircase to her bedroom, the floor creaking with each step. But as she reached the landing, she felt it again, a faint, unmistakable sense that she was being watched. The feeling was strange, almost absurd, yet so tangible that she instinctively turned to glance behind her. Nothing. Just the empty hallway leading to the other rooms, dimly lit by the flickering glow of her nightlight. Shaking her head, she dismissed the unease, telling herself that she was just tired and stressed from the move. She brushed her teeth, changed into pajamas, and finally crawled into bed, pulling the blankets up to her chin. The sheets were cold, and she found herself lying there, wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling. The silence was deep, pressing in on her like a weight. And then, in the quiet, she heard the noise again, closer this time, the same dragging sound, followed by what sounded like a faint, almost imperceptible sigh. Her body tensed, and she held her breath, straining her ears. But the noise didn't repeat, and she was left wondering if she'd only imagined it. Turning onto her side, she tried to calm herself, telling herself that it was just her mind playing tricks. The sound could have come from anywhere. Maybe there was an animal outside, or perhaps an old pipe rattling. She repeated these reassurances like a mantra, but as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, her thoughts kept circling back to Mrs. Cooper's strange words. "The house has its moods." Asterisk. In the silence, Emma felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of regret. The discovery. Emma's first few days on Hollow Creek Road passed quietly, but not peacefully. The unsettling noises she'd heard her first night continued, cropping up at odd hours, especially late at night when she was alone in the dark. It was always the same. Faint shuffling sounds, the creak of floorboards, and sometimes a soft thud that seemed to come from just above her bedroom. Each time, She tried to convince herself it was nothing unusual, just the quirks of an old house. But the unease settled deeper, an itch beneath her skin that refused to fade. One morning, after a sleepless night filled with strange sounds, Emma decided to search the house thoroughly. She wanted to reassure herself that there was nothing lurking in the shadows. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, she moved from room to room, opening closets, checking under furniture, and inspecting each corner. But everything was as it should be, empty, silent, still. Finally, she climbed the narrow staircase to the upstairs hallway, where the sounds seemed to come from most often. The hallway was dim, with the only light seeping in through a small, grimy window at the far end. As she passed each closed door, she felt an odd chill settle over her, a sensation of being unwelcome. Her eyes skimmed over the walls and baseboards, taking in the faded wallpaper and dust-laden corners, and then she noticed something strange. At the far end of the hall, near the window, was a small, almost hidden door, barely noticeable against the peeling wallpaper. The door was warped, its edges curling slightly as if it hadn't been opened in years. Emma could have sworn she'd looked over this entire hallway before, but somehow, she'd missed it. It was as if the door didn't want to be seen. Hesitating for a moment, she reached out, running her fingers over the rough, aged wood. A shiver crept up her spine, and she suddenly felt the urge to turn back, to leave whatever lay behind this door undiscovered. But curiosity pushed her forward, overriding the warning whispering in the back of her mind. She tugged on the handle, and with some effort, the door creaked open, releasing a stale, musty smell that seemed to spill from the darkness beyond. Inside was a small, shadowed room, no bigger than a closet. Dust coated every surface, and the air was heavy, as though untouched by time. Emma took a cautious step forward, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness. In the faint light, she noticed stains on the wooden floor, old and faint, but unmistakable. Dark smudges stretched across the boards, almost like footprints, leading to one corner of the room. There, half hidden in the shadows, was an old, battered box. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, its edges frayed and covered in dust. Emma crouched down, wiping a layer of dust from the top before lifting the lid. Inside, she found a collection of items that felt oddly personal, like glimpses into someone else's life. A small bundle of yellowed papers and clippings, some crude children's drawings, and at the very bottom, a tarnished silver locket. She lifted the locket, feeling its cold metal against her fingers, and opened it. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a young boy, no older than 6 or 7, his expression solemn and almost haunting. A chill ran through her as she flipped through the children's drawings, crudely scrawled with dark crayon lines. They depicted a house. This house, surrounded by trees, with shadowy shapes looming in the background. In one of the drawings, a small figure stood alone, circled by larger, darker forms. The unease in her stomach twisted into something sharper, more urgent. She felt as if she'd stumbled upon a piece of someone's life, a story that had been forgotten or, perhaps, buried. Emma closed the box and stood up, her heart racing as she glanced around the room. Strange scratch marks marred the walls, long and uneven, like claw marks. The sight made her take an instinctive step back, her pulse pounding in her ears. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened here, something that had left a mark on this room, this house. As she backed out of the room, closing the small door behind her, she realized that this discovery had only deepened her sense of unease. There was a presence here, an old, lingering sadness that seemed to seep from the very walls. She couldn't help but wonder who the boy in the photograph was, or why his drawings and belongings had been left behind in such a hidden place. Back in her bedroom, Emma sat on the edge of her bed, clutching the locket in her hand. She felt as if she'd opened a door to something that wasn't meant to be disturbed, something that would now refuse to leave her alone. And though she wanted to dismiss it all as her imagination, a part of her knew that she'd uncovered a piece of this house's dark history, a history that was still very much alive. That night, as she lay in bed, the sounds returned, louder and more insistent. The dragging noises, the faint whispers, and that eerie feeling of being watched. Emma lay awake, clutching the locket tightly, realizing that whatever secrets this house held, they were now hers to uncover, whether she wanted to or not. The haunting. Emma's nights grew increasingly troubled. Each time she lay down to sleep, it felt as if the house itself was keeping watch over her. The whispers, faint but undeniable, slipped through the silence, echoing off the walls in a language she couldn't quite make out. They started as soft murmurs, like the breeze through leaves, but as the hours dragged on, they grew sharper, more insistent. It was as though someone, or something, was trying to reach out to her from across a vast distance. In her dreams, the house transformed, taking on a sinister, distorted quality. She would wander through endless hallways, shadowed and cold, each corner hiding something unseen yet deeply familiar. And every night, without fail, she caught a glimpse of him, a young boy with hollow eyes, watching her from the shadows, his expression pleading. His face was blurry, as if covered by a fog, but his sorrow was unmistakable. "Help me," his voice whispered, barely audible yet unmistakable, seeping into her sleep and echoing in her mind even after she awoke. Days at the hospital offered little relief. Emma's exhaustion was evident, dark circles blooming beneath her eyes, her movements slower and unfocused. Sarah, a nurse she'd grown close to, finally cornered her one afternoon in the break room. "Emma, are you all right? You look like you haven't slept in days." Emma hesitated, reluctant to share her fears. It sounded too irrational. But something about Sarah's warm, concerned gaze softened her. "I've just been hearing things," she murmured, choosing her words carefully. "In the house. It's like there's someone there. Someone who needs help." Sarah raised an eyebrow, her expression shifting from concern to something more serious. "You know, some of the older folks around here talk about that house," she said, her voice low. "They say strange things happened there years ago. I don't know the details, but if you're curious, you might want to speak to Mr. Carter. He's the town historian, knows more about Hollow Creek's history than anyone." Emma thanked her and, later that afternoon, found herself standing outside Mr. Carter's office. She felt foolish, a rational, trained nurse about to talk to a stranger about ghostly whispers. But she couldn't ignore the urgency she'd felt in her dreams, the boy's sad, pleading face haunting her every step. Mr. Carter was an elderly man with sharp eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 stories. He listened intently as she described the hidden room, the boy in her dreams, and the strange items she'd found. His face grew pale, and he leaned back in his chair, looking troubled. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "Years ago," he began, his voice grave, "there was a family that lived in that house. The Hargroves. They were quiet, kept to themselves mostly. But one day, their youngest child, Thomas, just disappeared. Vanished without a trace. He was only 7. They searched the whole town, the woods, everything. But they never found him." Emma felt a chill settle over her. The boy's face in her dreams, his sad, hollow eyes, it was him. Did they ever find out what happened to him? She whispered. Mr. Carter shook his head, a deep sadness filling his eyes. "No, it was one of the town's darkest chapters. The family eventually moved away, but the house was never quite the same. It sat empty for years, and no one wanted to live there. People say they hear things, see things." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "Some folks believe that little Thomas never left, that he's still there, searching for someone to help him." Emma sat in stunned silence, her mind reeling. She'd stumbled upon a story that had been buried for decades, and the sadness of it gripped her heart. She felt a strange sense of responsibility, as if Thomas himself had chosen her to uncover the truth. That night, as she lay in bed, Emma felt a shift in the atmosphere of the house. The air grew thick, the whispers louder, more frantic. She no longer felt like a mere observer. Now, it was as if the house itself had latched onto her, its long-buried sorrows pouring into her mind. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of her vision, and the temperature dropped, a coldness settling over her that seeped into her bones. She heard it then. Footsteps, soft and hesitant, echoing in the hallway just outside her bedroom door. Heart pounding, she turned to look, and there, in the dim light, stood the shadow of a small boy. His form was faint, blurred at the edges, but she could see him clearly enough. His eyes were sad, wide with fear and hope all at once. "Help me," he whispered, his voice thin and ghostly, sending chills down her spine. Her fear melted away, replaced by a fierce need to ease the sorrow that hung over him like a cloud. She reached out, her hand trembling, but before she could touch him, he vanished, dissolving into the shadows as though he'd never been there at all. Emma lay awake the rest of the night, her mind whirling with questions. She knew now that Thomas was real, that his spirit was trapped here, bound by the weight of a past no one remembered. And as dawn broke, casting faint light across the walls of her room, she made a silent promise. She would find a way to help him, to uncover the truth of what had happened all those years ago. But as she watched the sunlight creep across the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever secrets the house held, they were darker, and more dangerous, than she could ever imagine. The encounter. The whispers grew louder with each passing night, no longer confined to the shadows but seeming to drift into Emma's waking hours, filling the house with an eerie tension that was impossible to ignore. The boy's voice echoed in her dreams, the quiet, pleading sound of, "Help me," playing on repeat, until it felt as if the words had been carved into her very mind. But tonight, there was something different in the air. A storm was brewing outside, thunder rumbling in the distance, shaking the house in deep, rolling waves. Emma sat in her living room, gripping a flashlight and glancing nervously around her. Every creak, every shudder of the walls felt amplified in the storm's wrath. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the room, and she felt an undeniable urge to go upstairs. She had avoided the small, hidden room for days, too afraid of what she might find, yet tonight it felt as if something was pulling her toward it, a strange magnetic pull she couldn't resist. Steeling herself, she stood and headed up the narrow staircase, the floorboards groaning beneath her. As she reached the top, the hallway seemed darker, almost suffocating. The hidden door stood at the end, blending into the wall, as if waiting for her. A gust of wind shook the house as she opened it, and the familiar scent of dust and something older, something decayed, washed over her. Inside, the small room was as she remembered, dusty and dim, with faint stains on the floor and scratch marks along the walls. But tonight, the air felt heavier, as though it was alive with a tension she could almost taste. Taking a shaky breath, Emma stepped inside, clutching the flashlight as she scanned the room. And then, just as she was about to turn away, she saw him. A shadowy figure stood in the corner, barely visible in the dark. It was the boy, the same boy from her dreams, his face faintly illuminated by her flashlight. He was small, thin, his shoulders hunched as if carrying a weight far too heavy for a child. His eyes were hollow, yet filled with a sorrow so deep it made Emma's chest ache. He stared at her, unmoving, his gaze piercing through her as if he could see straight into her soul. "Help me," he whispered, his voice so soft it was almost lost in the howling wind outside. Emma's heart raced, but she fought the fear that threatened to paralyze her. She felt a deep compassion for the boy, a need to release him from whatever torment held him captive. "Thomas," she whispered, taking a small step toward him. "What happened to you?" The boy's face twisted in pain, and he looked down, raising a hand to point toward the floor. Emma's gaze followed his gesture, and she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a faint outline, almost invisible beneath the dust, marking a rectangular shape in the floorboards. Kneeling down, Emma traced her fingers along the outline. It felt solid, but with a little effort, she pried one of the boards loose, revealing a small, hidden compartment beneath. Inside lay a tattered, faded notebook, its pages worn and brittle. Carefully, she opened it, her hands trembling as she scanned the scrawled handwriting within. The notebook belonged to Thomas's mother, and as she flipped through its pages, Emma's horror grew. The entries painted a dark picture of a household torn apart by grief and secrecy. The words described a little boy who had become withdrawn, plagued by nightmares and fearful of something, in the house, that he could never fully explain. The final entry was short, almost frantic. "Thomas won't stop crying. He says there's a man in his room, a shadow that watches him. I don't know how to help him. But I think it's not only Thomas who needs help." Asterisk. A chill washed over Emma, and as she looked up, she realized that the boy was no longer alone. A dark, shadowy figure stood behind him, towering and ominous, its form shifting and flickering as if made of smoke. Emma's blood turned to ice. She could sense malevolence radiating from it, a cold, unfeeling presence that seemed to drain the air from the room. The boy's lips moved, but this time, the words were different. "He's here, he won't let me go." His voice trembled, filled with a fear that broke Emma's heart. She wanted to reach out, to pull him away from the shadow, but her feet felt rooted to the floor, her body frozen in terror. Summoning every ounce of courage, she took a step forward, raising the flashlight. The shadow shifted, almost recoiling from the light, and for a brief moment, its form wavered, breaking apart like smoke in the wind. Emma felt a surge of hope, realizing that perhaps, just perhaps, this darkness could be defeated. "Leave him alone," she shouted, her voice shaking but strong. She focused the flashlight on the shadow, watching as it twisted, contorting in response to the light. The boy took a small step back, his gaze fixed on her with a mixture of fear and hope, as if he was reaching out to her, trusting her to save him. The storm outside reached a fever pitch, lightning illuminating the room in a blinding flash, and for one heartbeat, everything seemed to freeze. The shadow let out a low, inhuman growl, the sound vibrating through the walls, before it dissolved completely, leaving only the boy behind. He looked up at her, a faint smile crossing his face, his features softening as if he was finally at peace. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with a gratitude so pure it brought tears to Emma's eyes. And then, like a wisp of smoke, he faded, leaving the room empty and silent. Emma stood there for a long moment, letting the silence settle around her. She felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted, the oppressive atmosphere in the house dissipating. She knew, deep down, that Thomas was free, that whatever darkness had held him captive had finally been vanquished. Exhausted but strangely at peace, Emma closed the small door to the hidden room and made her way back to her bedroom. She no longer felt watched, no longer sensed the lingering sadness in the air. For the first time since moving in, she felt as if the house was truly hers, no longer haunted, but filled with a gentle, quiet presence that felt almost like gratitude. The release. The following days felt transformed for Emma. The haunting presence that had once cloaked the house in fear had lifted, replaced by a newfound calm that washed over her like sunlight breaking through a heavy storm. Each morning, she awoke feeling lighter, the shadows that had haunted her dreams now replaced by a warmth that filled her heart. Thomas was free, and somehow, that knowledge brought her a deep sense of peace. Still, a lingering curiosity tugged at her. She needed to know the full story behind Thomas and his family, the truth that had been hidden for so long. She felt a responsibility to honor their memories, to ensure that Thomas's spirit would never be forgotten. Determined, she contacted Mr. Carter once more, eager to dig deeper into the history of the Hargrove family. The historian welcomed her into his office, his eyes sparkling with a mix of curiosity and concern. "You look different," he said, studying her face closely. "There's a lightness about you. Did you find what you were looking for?" Emma nodded, her heart racing. "I saw him, Mr. Carter. Thomas. He was trapped, but I think he's at peace now. But I need to know what happened to his family. There's so much that feels unfinished." Mr. Carter's expression shifted, and he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. The Hargrove family was indeed a tragic tale. After Thomas disappeared, the parents fell into despair. They searched for him for months but eventually, unable to bear the grief, they packed up and left. They tried to start anew elsewhere, but the shadow of their loss followed them. Emma listened intently as Mr. Carter continued. "Years later, I learned from a few neighbors that they believed Thomas had drowned in the creek behind the house, but no body was ever found. They thought that maybe the parents covered it up, ashamed to admit their child had been lost under their watch. The house, they said, grew cold after Thomas's disappearance, as if it mourned for him. After they left, the house fell into disrepair and became a place of local legend, a home that no one dared to enter." As he spoke, Emma felt the weight of history pressing down on her, the sorrow of the Hargrove family resonating within her. "I found his mother's notebook," she said, pulling it from her bag. It had drawings, entries about his fear of a shadow in the house. "I think that shadow was tied to their grief, the darkness that filled their lives after losing him." Mr. Carter took the notebook, his brow furrowing as he skimmed through the fragile pages. "This is important," he murmured. "It can shed light on the family's struggles and the love that remained even amidst their tragedy. We need to ensure Thomas is remembered properly." With his guidance, Emma began to piece together the story of the Hargrove family, seeking out old newspaper articles and reaching out to those who might remember them. She discovered that Thomas had been a vibrant boy, loved deeply by his family, and the tragedy of his loss had irrevocably changed them. The research helped her understand the depth of the sorrow that had suffocated the house for so long. As Emma gathered information, a plan began to form in her mind. She wanted to honor Thomas, to ensure his story was shared, to give him the memorial he deserved. With Mr. Carter's assistance, she organized a small ceremony at the house, inviting townsfolk who remembered the Hargroves, as well as a few local historians and friends from the hospital. The day of the ceremony arrived, a bright autumn afternoon, and Emma felt a nervous energy buzzing in her chest. She had prepared a small wooden cross, adorned with flowers, and beside it, she placed the locket and drawings she had found in the hidden room. It was a tribute, a heartfelt offering to a boy who had lost his way, a way to say goodbye and thank you. As guests arrived, whispers of curiosity filled the air, the crowd mingling beneath the towering trees that lined the property. Emma stood at the front, her heart racing, her hands trembling slightly as she faced them. She shared Thomas's story, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Today, we honor Thomas Hargrove, a boy who was loved and lost, whose spirit still lingers in this place. Let us remember him not with fear, but with love. After Emma spoke, Mr. Carter shared stories about the Hargrove family, weaving a tapestry of their lives that was rich with laughter, love, and ultimately, heartache. As he spoke, Emma noticed the air around her grow warmer, almost electric, as if the very house was alive with the memory of Thomas. She could almost feel him there, watching, a gentle presence enveloping her like a hug from the past. As the ceremony drew to a close, Emma took a deep breath and whispered a prayer, asking Thomas to rest in peace, to know he was loved and remembered. As she placed the last flower at the base of the cross, a sudden gust of wind rustled through the trees, lifting her hair and sending a chill down her spine. But it wasn't a chill of fear, it was a sense of release, a feeling of something lifting. With that gust, Emma felt a profound sense of closure wash over her. The burden of sorrow that had hung over the house began to dissipate, replaced by a lightness that filled her heart. She looked around at the gathering, their expressions solemn yet warm, and she realized she wasn't alone. They were all there, honoring Thomas together, carrying the memory of a boy who had been lost but was now found. In the days that followed, the house felt different. The whispers that had haunted her were gone, replaced by a sense of calm that enveloped her like a protective blanket. Emma remained in the house for years, feeling as though she was sharing her life with a gentle, unseen presence, no longer haunted but watched over. And as the seasons changed and the years passed, she often found herself smiling as she gazed out at the trees, knowing that Thomas was finally at peace, his story told, his spirit free.